Welcome back to the debate on France 24, where we've been discussing tax havens and asking how far Europe should go to either limit or even terminate their existence. And joining me again to continue the discussion here in the studio to my right, Jean Marquet, Advocacy Officer on Financing for Development at the CCFD, the Catholic Committee Against Hunger and Development. Joining us via satellite from Washington, Daniel Mitchell, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute. From Zurich, Andreas Misbach, Head of the Private Finance Program for the Berne Declaration. And from London, Alex Cobham, who is Policy Manager now at Christian Aid. Thanks all so much for joining us again. I think it's important to go back a step and make the distinction. Now, let me go straight to Zurich. Andreas, I'll have you address this. Of individuals and businesses that use tax havens versus banks that use tax havens. The reason that this has become an issue now in Europe today is because banks that are now being bailed out by the taxpayers, some of which I should say are being bailed out by taxpayer money, have actually not been paying taxes by hiding their money offshore or in tax havens. So make that distinction then for me if you can, Andreas. There is quite a line to be drawn between individuals who use tax havens versus banks.
Yeah, well, you can see it that way, and you just have to have a look at the list of tax haven subsidiaries that the banks have to see that they definitely use their knowledge to minimize their own tax payments. But there is also the other thing that banks, of course, are helping individuals to evade taxes. And this is done, for example, in Switzerland, which is the world's major offshore private banking place, with 1/3 of the world market in that. And this is also done by foreign banks in Switzerland. For example, banks from France, from Germany, that administer money via their Swiss subsidiaries and help French-German citizens to evade their taxes. And some of those banks are actually receiving taxpayers' money in the bailout, as you said. So there is obviously a reason that the governments now should put a focus on the banks. And when you look at...
Sorry, I was going to ask Alex for his comments on that, too. I mean, is that where we should really be focused right now, or the EU should be focusing on banks and their use of tax havens, maybe leave the individual accounts and smaller businesses out of it for now?
I think we need to see this as a structural problem and a systemic one. If we only deal with one part of the problem, it's like squeezing a balloon. We'll simply force the evasion activity into another part of the system. So the EU Savings Tax Directive, for example, only addressed potential tax haven abuse by individuals and only on income that was earned as interest. As a result, there was an increase in people setting up trusts rather than acting as individuals, and also people moving their money to gain other forms of income which didn't come under the directive. What we really need to see within Europe is for that directive to be extended to individuals, trusts and companies and all forms of income, not only interest. But from my point of view, this isn't only a problem for the rich countries. It's, if anything, more important for the poorer countries. And what we need to see is that the measures that are going to be taken against havens and to increase the transparency of the corporate sector in general, that they should also be to the benefit of developing countries who are going to suffer from this crisis with the rest of us.
Okay. Daniel, let me ask you this question more specifically. Do you at least concede that banks that have hidden earnings or, any kind of accounts in offshore or tax haven banks or accounts should at least now be responsible for paying some back taxes, considering in the cases of the ones that are being bailed out by taxpayer funds?
Well, I'm certainly not a fan of banks being bailed out by taxpayers. I was very much against the bailout that the Bush administration pushed through here in the United States, and I think other countries are being similarly mistaken by cozying up to their financial sector. Having said that, I'm a firm believer in territorial taxation. If a bank earns money inside the U.S., then by all means, the IRS should tax them. I hope at a low rate, but if they want to do a high rate, whatever, that's their business. Likewise, if there's a French bank, or for that matter, a German subsidiary in France, France should tax those banks. But if a U.S. bank or a French bank has a subsidiary in Switzerland, that's not the business, or at least it shouldn't be their business. That's solely a business of Swiss law and Swiss taxation in an ideal system. Now, having said that, what about this European Savings Tax Directive? If Europe expands the Savings Tax Directive, what's going to happen? You're going to increase the amount of money coming to the U.S., so by all means, you guys do it. We want more prosperity here. You're going to increase the amount of money going to Hong Kong and Singapore. I mean, if Europe wants to shoot itself in the foot with higher taxation and a savings tax cartel, go ahead and do it, but understand there's going to be very heavy consequences. A much better approach would be to lower tax rates. Ask yourself, why is there almost no tax evasion in Hong Kong? Because tax rates are very low, the government's very honest, government services are only focusing on the legitimate needs, not on redistribution, which is why a lot of people get upset with governments being too greedy. Hong Kong is your role model. You don't want to wind up being a theme park for tourists from Japan and the U.S. because you drive your economy into the tank with high taxes.
Okay, go ahead, Jean.
Thank you, Daniel, for quoting this example of Hong Kong, because it's precisely where the son of Denis Sassou Nguesso, the dictator of Congo-Brazzaville, hid his money, his stolen money from his country's oil, and he's been spending millions in big cars, etc. And I think if that's the kind of a heaven, the paradise that you're prizing, that's not the world in which we want to live. In fact, tax havens have been organizing a world with no rule. They're trying to organize a world where you could escape regulations that's been built elsewhere, be it tax regulation, be it financial regulation, and that's why they're at the heart of the current financial turmoil, and be it criminal law as well, and that's why the criminals find an escape as well in those tax havens. So if you believe in democracy, you should...
I ask anybody, provide a shred of evidence that any of the financial turmoil which was caused by housing bubbles in high-tax nations show a single shred of evidence that this had anything to do with tax havens. It didn't.
I have one. Just look at the first two German banks that have collapsed a year ago. Both of them have collapsed because of their offshore conduits, so-called special investment vehicles that were in tax havens, located in tax havens. And those were the first two banks that collapsed already a year ago. And now I would like to say something on the territorial principle of taxation you mentioned. This is simply not adequate to our today's globalized, interconnected world. It doesn't make sense because we're not living in a world of isolated nation states. For example, in my country, in Switzerland, there is a big problem with the domestic tax laws for the rest of the world. Because Switzerland makes a distinction between tax evasion, which is not treated a crime in Switzerland, and tax fraud, which is a crime, Switzerland gives no information whatsoever to other countries in cases of tax evasion, which is in...